All right. Hello, everyone. How are you? The sun's coming out. I know. It's kind of a rough morning. It was kind of a rough night, wasn't it? We're going to get it back tonight, so hope you're in your orange, right? You want a big applause for the Astros? Come on. We're in the shadow of Minute Maid as we speak. My name's Frank Billingsley. I'm glad you're here. We decided this is our 9th time to be here and my 8th, and I'm always delighted. I always have something different. Last year, I think I was talking about my hair transplants. Still looks pretty good. They held. Yes, it's like a good solid oyster reef. It just clings. And so what's changed? Oh, you know what's changed this time? I finally bit the bullet and I got hearing aids. I'm totally out of the closet on the hearing aids. I mean, it's so funny. The biggest compliment you can get with hearing aids is, I can't even see them. Nobody ever says, you know, you look great in those blue hearing aids. Those hearing aids make you look so thin. Nobody ever says that. It's always, but anyway, it could change your life. So if you're thinking about hearing aids, I'm just telling you, a good thing. I also wrote a book, by the way. You may have read some publicity on this. It's called Swabbed and Found. I did a DNA search for my biological family. I'm adopted. And I found them all. And it wasn't easy. It's kind of like a Hardy Boys book, like a mystery, like the mystery of the lost orphan. And I found them all, and the more I told the story, the more people said, you should write a book. And so I did. And in the process, and the book's about family, and we're all family. The family you're born into, the family you choose, the family you create, the community that you're a part of, the family that comes to your rescue that you don't even know when a Hurricane Harvey hits, the family that you become when a sports team is going for a world championship. So we're all family. But I also learned that DNA is an amazing thing. And I talked briefly about DNA, mostly about family, but we share 99.5% of our DNA, all human beings. Did you know that? 99.5%. We share 50% of our DNA with a banana. That's beside the point. So I started looking it up and I thought, well, we probably share DNA with a fish. Did you know that we share 73% of our DNA of the human genome code with zebrafish, and 84% of our diseases in our code are found in the zebrafish? And this is why we chose not to eat the zebrafish today. But we're going to eat the red snapper because they're like a 16th cousin. But if you've ever looked at your gills and think why we love the water, there may be a DNA connection there. And so as much as we love the bay and as much as we count on it, we probably never thought that far, that I'm protecting living organisms. I'm part of them and they're part of me. We're all part of the world community, and they deserve my respect simply because they're alive. Oysters are alive, shrimp are alive. That bay that we fly over getting back from New Orleans, that is alive. Probably more than New Orleans after we leave it. But that is why we are here, to keep that bay part of this community. So I welcome you on behalf of some of the most delightful people I've met today. The Briscoes are just terrific. The Marla and Monty are our luncheon chair people. Thank you so much for having this. Of course, the board of directors. We have honorees today from business and government and community, and we're going to recognize them, and we're going to celebrate GBF's past accomplishments and look ahead to the future, because we need GBF for the future of Galveston Bay. So now, without further ado, Bob Stokes, president of the Galveston Bay Foundation. Bob.
Thank you very much, Frank. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome everyone here today. We are really, really happy to see you. As you know, this event was originally scheduled for just after Hurricane Harvey. We pushed it back to give people time to focus on recovery efforts. We hope that if you were impacted by the floods, those recovery efforts have begun and are underway for you. But we know that process is a long one, and we appreciate you being here today with us. So GBF, Galveston Bay Foundation, we've also responded to Hurricane Harvey issues and impacts around the bay. We mobilized nearly 70 water quality monitors to begin taking water samples as quickly as we could after the storm to figure out what the bacteria levels were, what the turbidity levels were, what the salinity levels were. We organize volunteers in multiple cleanups to clean up debris around the bay. There's a lot of trash and debris that gets washed down in a big storm like that. For one particular cleanup at Morgan's Point, we had over 100 volunteers clean up 2,540 pounds of debris that had washed onto the beach there. And we continue to invest in things like oyster restoration efforts. Our oyster reefs were hit very hard. We had so much fresh water in the bay, it was almost like a lake, and oysters don't do well in those conditions. And so we've lost somewhere between 25 and 85% of our oyster crop for this season. So it just goes to show why it's important to invest back into restoration efforts like that. So again, thank you all for being here. Just a little background on the foundation. I talk about this every year. Just our history as an organization, we've always tried to embrace a true cross-section of users. And by that I mean the recreational users, the folks who are out there fishing and swimming and kiteboarding and just the craziest things you can do on the bay and having fun. But we also involve the commercial users of the bay, the folks who make their living harvesting shrimp and harvesting oysters. One of our board members owns a restaurant in Clear Lake called Tommy's Restaurant and Oyster Bar, and he loves serving Galveston Bay oysters when he can. He wants a healthy population of Galveston Bay oysters so he can serve them to us so we can eat them. And that's a great reason to support the Galveston Bay Foundation. And then of course we work with all the industrial users around the bay. We have this great complex of shipping and petrochem, and we all try to bring those people together and work in the best long-term interest of Galveston Bay. So we wouldn't be here without that support from that diverse community. I want to thank our donors and auction donors. You'll see their names on the screens as the screens roll. Particularly want to thank our Guardian sponsors, Kirby Marine, Catherine McGovern, and the McGovern Foundation. We want to thank the Protector sponsors we have, the Hildebrand Fund, Robert Jamail, Marilyn and Harry Kirk with ACT Pipe and Supply, NRG, Satterfield and Ponticus, and then Cynthia and Don Stevenson with the Madeline Stevenson Foundation. So thank you. And of course we work with Shell Oil. Shell Oil's here. We just finished our bike around the bay a couple weekends ago, and it was wonderful. And then I also want to thank all the elected officials. We have some elected officials in the audience. If you want to stand, I'd like to recognize you and their representatives. So thank you for being here. And in particular, one special thanks today, County Attorney Vince Ryan. I know Vince is here. So Vince, please take a quick stand. So I wanted to point this out. Galveston Bay Foundation has been working with the County Attorney's Office, with the San Jacinto River Coalition for, it seems like about a decade to get the San Jacinto Waste Pit Superfund site cleaned up. And we've worked really, really hard. Jackie Young is here from the San Jacinto River Coalition. And I hope if you've been reading the newspapers, you saw the final solution that the EPA has proposed, the record of decision, and it is a full cleanup of that Superfund site. They're going to dig up that waste, haul it away to somewhere, and finally get that site cleaned up. So thank you, Vince, and thank you, Jackie. So as you eat your dinner, please take a look at the slides that are running on the screens. See some things that you have helped make happen. Our efforts don't happen without your support, so thank you very much. And then one really fun task I have is to invite Marla and Monty up to the stage to thank them and let us know how much we appreciate your efforts. Marla and Monty have done an amazing job this year as the co-chairs of the event. We expect to raise over $300,000. They've both been supporters on other levels. They have a beautiful home in Lafitte's Cove, which they've opened up to us on multiple occasions. And Monty has truly embraced his service as a board member. So how about a round of applause for Marla and Monty? And so Frank, I'm going to take care of it. Yep. You guys enjoy your lunch for a bit, and we will be back. So enjoy. Thank you.
That was one heck of a snapper. For our award presentation, here's Bob Stokes, president of the Galveston Bay Foundation, joined by the chair of GBF's board of directors, Guy Robert Jackson. All right. Our first recipient, we applaud the Harris County Pollution Control for truly going above and beyond in their efforts to protect Galveston Bay. Please welcome to the stage Guardian of the Bay honoree for Government, Harris County Pollution Control, represented here today by Jennifer Wheeler and Latrice Babin. And they make great table mates. And Bob has a special announcement.
So many of you know, or some of you know anyway, that before I worked for the Galveston Bay Foundation, I worked for the Harris County Attorney's Office as an assistant county attorney doing environmental work. And we represented a number of different county agencies, but I can say from the bottom of my heart, my favorite agency was Harris County Pollution Control, and my favorite agency rep was Jennifer Wheeler. And Jennifer is retiring this month after 28 years working at Harris County Pollution Control. So I wanted to just ask you to give her a great round of applause for all that she has done on behalf of Harris County during that time.
Congratulations. All right, we're also proud to honor 2 Eagle Scouts from Troop 446 Bay Area Council for their continued efforts to preserve and protect the natural resources of Galveston Bay. Please welcome to the stage our Guardian of the Bay Award honorees for Community, Justin Alexander Rierick and Ryan Reinhardt. And we are happy to recognize Lyondale Bazell for their special appreciation of the Bay and their efforts to preserve this cherished resource. Please welcome Dale Friedrichs to the stage. And now Bob.
Yeah. All right, hey, but what about another round of applause for those honorees? I hope you enjoyed that video. It's always fun hearing their reaction to being named Guardian of the Bays. So now we turn to our keynote speaker, and it is a true privilege, really an honor, to introduce our speaker. Andrew Sampson is a research professor of geography and executive director of the Meadows Center for the Water and Environmental at Texas State University. My notes say that Andy is one of Texas's leading conservationists, but I'm going to go one step further and say he is the lead conservationist in the state of Texas. He's a former executive director at Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, former director of the Nature Conservancy Texas chapter. He's really dedicated his life to environmental conservation. He's the author of 5 books, a multitude of additional published works, the recipient of numerous awards, and now at Texas State University, he coordinates university policy and research related to freshwater resources, manages the headwaters of the San Marcos River, administers the most extensive freshwater environmental education program in Texas, supervises the training and coordination of more than 1,000 volunteer water quality monitors in rivers and streams throughout the state of Texas. I could go on forever, but let me just say again how honored we are to have Andy Sampson with us today. And so Andy, please join me up here, and please help me give Andy a round of applause.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all. I assure you that the honor is mine. This is a sensational organization which has done so much for this region. There's nothing else like it that I'm aware of in the United States, and one of the reasons for that is its leadership, not only on the board, but by Bob Stokes himself. So it's an honor for me to be here. It's also a wonderful privilege for me to be here because there are so many people in the audience that I look out and see that I've known for so many years and work with. When I went to work for the Nature Conservancy, Frank Smith was the president at that time and was my boss. I look down and I see Carol Dinkins, who is one of my supervisors on the Parks and Wildlife Commission. So I grew up in this area. I consider it my home. And so for all of those reasons, I appreciate you all including me today. And like everyone in Texas who doesn't live in Houston and beyond Texas, our hearts have gone out to you over the past weeks. We've been anxious to try to figure out what we could do to help, but we've also been inspired by the response of this community and the inspiration that the wake of this horrible event has given the rest of the United States. And my fingernails are almost gone waiting for that last game tonight. And I think they're going to do it. You know, when Carol and I served together at Parks and Wildlife, one of the reasons why the Astros mean so much to me, not just because my dad took me to the Colt 45s, but because we served at Parks and Wildlife with Nolan Ryan. And of course, one of the great things about the success of that team is the involvement of the Ryan family. I don't know that I've ever met anyone that I admired as much as Nolan Ryan. He is one of the most unassuming, humble people that I've ever met, in spite of the fact that he's one of the greatest pitchers that ever lived. I once asked Nolan what the greatest honor that had ever been paid to him was. And he said, I was pitching in Cincinnati when Pete Rose was within 2 hits of breaking Stan Musial's all-time hit record. And if you all remember Pete Rose, he had a pretty sizable mouth. And so all of his interviews in the newspaper were that not only was he going to break Musial's record, but he was going to break it off of Nolan Ryan. So the great day came. Musial was in the stands. He brought down his family. And Pete Rose got a hit and tied the record. And then the rest of the time he came to bat during that day, Nolan struck him out. And so he threw a fit out on the field. He threw his bat, he threw his batting helmet, he was cursing. In fact, they thought he was going to charge the mound. But when he got into the dugout where the fans could not see him, he turned to the mound and he went, "He got me." And Nolan said that was the greatest honor that had ever been paid him. He and I were down in Cuero one time, which is where he was born, and we stopped at a restaurant. Without any plans to do so, it was time for lunch, so we stopped at this restaurant. And when we got ready to go, after we ate, we went up to the cash register, and the waitress said, "You know who you look like?" And his response was, "Yeah, people have told me that." And she said, "You know, he was born here." And Nolan said, "Yeah, I've heard that." And she said, "Let me show you something." And she reached in the cash register and she took out an old baseball card with Nolan's picture. And she said, "My son told me that if he ever came in here, I should get him to sign this card." And Nolan said, "Well, now's your chance." And she said, "No, I want Nolan Ryan to do it." And so he said, "Well, thanks very much." And he started for the door, and the other waitress goes, "Janie, that was him." And so he signed the card, and the lady was able to please her son. When I grew up in the Houston area and got out of school, I decided that incorrectly, that the place that all good things happened was Washington, D.C. So I got there as fast as I could. Now, this was during the days of the Vietnam War and the beginnings of the environmental movement, and I was very much involved, certainly in the environmental side of it. And I wrote things like op-ed pieces and other things. And you may remember that in the first years of the Nixon administration, he had appointed a gentleman who was the governor of Alaska named Walter Hickel to be Secretary of Interior. Well, Hickel was very outspoken, And his office overlooked the mall, so almost every day he saw thousands of young people out demonstrating, and he wrote a famous letter to President Nixon which said, you should listen to these kids. He didn't recommend that he follow what they wanted to do, but he said you should sit down and listen to them. And he made a terrible mistake by releasing the letter. And so he was fired. And President Nixon then appointed a man named Rogers Morton to be Secretary of Interior. Mr. Morton was an astonishing person. He was an heir to the Pillsbury fortune. He was about 6'8". He lived with his wife in Francis Scott Key's home on the eastern shore of Maryland. And I got a call one day, shortly after he was appointed, saying, the secretary would like to see you. I thought, man. So I cut my hair. I went to his office. We had a fairly spirited conversation about my views on the environment and conservation. And he turned to an aide and he said, take him upstairs. Well, we go upstairs and there's a couple of assistants down on the floor cutting and pasting press releases to put his speeches together. So he takes me back down and the secretary says, I'm going to give the commencement address at the University of Maryland tomorrow night. Would you write the speech? I took a deep breath and I said, I'll give it a try. I called my wife and I told her that I couldn't come home, that I had this project, and I stayed up there at the Interior Department and wrote the speech, went home in the morning and took a shower, came back and met him, and he marked it up and I took it upstairs and brought him a clean draft. He went to the University of Maryland and made the speech, and then I went to work as a speechwriter on Monday morning. I didn't last very long, because I was always trying to get my views into the speeches. But we remained very close friends until the end of his life. And about that time, a man named Bob Armstrong, whom I know many of you know, he was a great friend of Galveston Bay, was elected land commissioner in Texas. And so I'm like 26 years old, working there in Interior, and I immediately wrote him a letter and said, you know, Mr. Armstrong, Commissioner Armstrong, if there's ever anything you need in Washington, please let me know, and I would be glad to be of service to you. Well, what he was doing was, one of the first things he did was to begin to increase the leasing of offshore oil tracts on the state tidelands. And one of those leasing areas was off of a place called Matagorda Island. Well, those of you who are familiar with that part of Texas, it's one of the key wintering areas for the whooping crane. So two institutions became extremely upset with Bob's plans. One was the Pentagon, because Matagorda Island at that time was a Strategic Air Command base. The second was the National Audubon Society, because they couldn't figure out how offshore oil drilling and whooping cranes could get along, which they can. But anyway, so the secretary called me in and he said, do you know anything about this place? Well, I knew very little, but I knew enough to sound intelligent. And so he asked me or directed me to go down to Matagorda Island and perform an analysis on the issue and come back and report to him. Well, I went to Matagorda Island in 1973, and while I was there, a plane load of generals flew in from Vietnam to go white-tailed deer hunting. And basically what I determined was that it was largely a recreation area, which is fine, but it was certainly not the best use of that resource. And so I've turned in my report and I recommended that the island become a national wildlife refuge. Well, he agreed with me. And he sent a letter to the Secretary of Defense, who was, interestingly at that time, a bird watcher named James Schlesinger, and recommended that the base be closed and the island become a national wildlife refuge. Well, we didn't get a response. I delivered the letter to the Pentagon the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and by Christmas we still had no response. Well, we'd made a deal with Audubon that if we didn't get anything out of defense, then we would slip them the report. So during the Christmas holidays, I gave them the report. And I lived out in Virginia at the time, and I remember going to catch the bus into work, and I would always buy a Washington Post at the newsstand, and then I'd read it on the way in. And I sat down in my seat on the bus, and I opened up the paper, and the whole bottom half of the paper was a photograph of the whooping cranes. And I remember thinking, wow, I was exhilarated, but I also thought, I'm doomed. And sure enough, I lasted about 2 months and ended up, thankfully, coming back to Texas, where ultimately I found my way to the Nature Conservancy and had the great pleasure of working in and around Galveston Bay for many, many years. My first big project was at the additions to the Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge. I acquired the Candy Absher Wildlife Management Area at Smith Point, Atkinson Island, and so my involvement in Galveston Bay with the support of organizations like this goes back many years. I should have told you that when I had contacted Bob Armstrong, he actually came to see me in my office, and at the time he was working to acquire a property out in Big Bend called the Big Bend Ranch. It was owned by Robert O. Anderson, who was the founder of Atlantic Richfield. At that time was sort of the Ted Turner of his day. He was the largest private landowner in the United States. And Armstrong came into my office and he could not stop talking about Big Bend Ranch, but all he talked about was the stars. You know, there are two of the highest waterfalls in Texas are on the ranch. It has like 42 miles of Rio Grande frontage, but his entire excitement was over the sky and the stars. Well, anyway, after working at the Nature Conservancy, I was hired by the Parks and Wildlife Department, and it's interesting to look back at those days, which was about 1987. The Parks and Wildlife was being criticized for not acquiring enough land by the legislature. It's almost impossible to conceive today. But here's a fact for you. The last time the state of Texas passed a park bond issue was when John Connolly was governor. We have not had a statewide park bond issue since the mid-60s when John Connolly was in the governor's mansion. And by the time I got there in 1987, they still had about $25 million of that left. It was original bond issue was about $75 million. Well, I'm always managed to be in the right place at the right time, which is one of my good fortunes and blessings. And so I landed there with about $25 million to spend, and the savings and loan crisis hit. And so virtually every ranch in Texas was for sale. So I went through the $25 million in about 2.5 years, and we acquired over 500,000 acres of land, including the Big Bend Ranch. And by that time, Bob Armstrong was a member of the Parks and Wildlife Commission, and so he was able to make the motion to acquire the ranch. One of the things that I was told when I came home from D.C. was that there's two people that you must find when you get to Texas. One is Perry Bass, and the other is Terry Hershey. And I will tell you that there's never been a couple that were more dedicated to this bay than Jake and Terry Hershey. And their resources continue today to help in its conservation. So fast forward to my appointment as the executive director of Parks and Wildlife, and everybody anticipated that Clayton Williams was going to be the governor. And we all know what happened. And I'd been in my new job about 3 months when the world turned upside down and Ann Richards was elected governor. Well, one of her potential appointees got some very bad advice, and he announced that he was going to be the chairman of the commission. Well, it turned out that he had some game violations or something. Back in his past, there were he shot too many ducks or something like that. And so all of a sudden it was on the front pages all over the state. And so I get a call from the treasurer's office where Ann Richards was the state treasurer. And they said, Ms. Richards would like to see you. And so I go over there, and she comes out and takes me back into her office, and it's just she and I. And she tells me that she's grown up fishing in the Brazos, hunting doves with her dad, that she loves to run the Rio Grande at Big Bend, and that everything she's heard about what I was doing at Parks and Wildlife, she's supportive of. But, she says, it has come to my attention that some of the staff, which I took to mean me, is making trouble for one of my appointees. And she said, this is how this is going to work. Appointing these commissioners is my responsibility, and running that department is your responsibility. I'll stay out of your business, and you stay out of mine. And I went home and I told my wife that's probably the best meeting I ever had with a supervisor. So fast forward 3 months later, her 3 new appointees appear at the Parks and Wildlife Commission, and one of them is Terry Hershey. Well, it was my first meeting, and obviously the new commissioners, where they set the seasons and the bag limits for fishing game in Texas. And Carol will tell you that in those days, it was pretty primitive. We didn't have PowerPoints. We didn't have the ability to do fancy graphics. And so what the biologists would do is they'd come in from all over the state in a day-long session, and they would show pictures of like 50 deer hanging up in a processing house as a way of demonstrating that there had been a healthy harvest in East Texas or the rolling plains. Well, at the end of all these presentations, the chairman of the commission allowed each one of the commissioners to comment, and it came to Terry, and she said, I think I'm going to throw up. Terry was on the newspapers all over the state. And I get my second call from Ann Richards. And she says, Andy, what are we going to do about Terry Hershey? I said, Governor, appointing the commissioners is your responsibility. Terry Hershey became one of the best commissioners that ever served on that department. She led the Parks and Wildlife Department into protecting private lands across the state. She is the person who began the movement that now resulted in 40 land trusts across the state that acquire conservation easements, which allow private landowners to remain on the land, but at the same time to protect it perpetually. That was an incredible responsibility and privilege that I had for almost 12 years. There's not many jobs where on the first day of the job, you get to ride the battleship of Texas on the bridge to its permanent berth at the San Jacinto Battleground. And yet on the second day, I'm getting ready, I'm still pretty nervous, I'm in the bathroom listening to the news, and I hear that an oil spill has hit Galveston Bay and the Parks and Wildlife Department is in charge of cleaning it up. There's not many jobs where you can get on a raft and float the Rio Grande through the Big Bend with the governor of the state, talking about conservation both in Texas and in Mexico. But I remember getting home after one of those trips and just telling my wife what a great time I had. And I got a call saying that one of our Texas game wardens had shot and killed a man in East Texas, and they were waiting for my instructions. So I had the ability to see more of Texas than most people should ever see in a lifetime, to understand the wonderfully diverse cultures of our state. But I also got called just about every name it's possible to call anyone in Texas. And someone said, that's a big vocabulary. I learned over those years, when I started that job, I was a fair-haired boy up in the legislature. But by making a decision every day for 12 years that made somebody happy and somebody mad, it's the mad ones that accumulate. So by the end of that 12 years, I had a lot of barnacles. And I was at an appropriations hearing one day, and I was just beat up. And I staggered out into the hall in the Capitol Extension, and at that time, the wonderful president of then Southwest Texas University, Jerry Supple, was he was up that afternoon, so he followed me out in the hall, and he said, if you ever get tired of this, you can come down to Texas State, or Southwest Texas. Well, I didn't think too much about it, but about 6 months later, I called him up. And I now work in the honeymoon suite of the Ocarina Springs Hotel, which many of you may have stayed in over the years. That spring is the second largest spring in the western United States. It's home to 8 federally listed endangered or threatened species, and it is one of the oldest, and quite possibly the oldest continuously inhabited site by human beings in North America. And what I've learned since I've been there is that water is the most critical issue facing the coming generation of Texans. If you take nothing more away from this luncheon today, it's that our population is going to double in the next 50 years, and yet we have already given permission for more water to be withdrawn from most of our rivers than is actually in them. Such that if all those water rights were actually exercised today, many of our most iconic rivers would be dry. And yet we have to find water for twice as many people. We waste too much water. San Antonio and El Paso have lowered their consumption of water by 40% per capita and still managed to grow. San Antonio has grown by 1.5 million people over the last 15 years or so, and yet its overall consumption of water has been flat. And yet, we have cities in Texas where, number one, we lose as much as 25% of all the water in the system just because we're not taking care of the water mains, where per capita consumption of water is still increasing. And ladies and gentlemen, that is not sustainable. We treat groundwater and surface water as if they were different substances. Think about the Blanco. The Blanco starts out in Kendall County, south of Fredericksburg. It flows southeastward toward Hays County, where I work, and before it gets to the Hays County line, most of the flow goes right back into the aquifer. It flows underground to a beautiful spring, which I know many have visited, called Jacob's Well. It comes up out of the ground, and it flows down Cypress Creek through the village of Wimberley and back into the Blanco. If you tried to get a water rights permit to take any appreciable amount of water out of the Blanco, it would be denied because it's already overcommitted. But if you want to go up above Jacob's Well and drill a hole in the ground, you can drill just about as much of it as you're man or woman enough to pump with hardly any regulation. If you've got children that are asking you what they should do when they get out of school, tell them to be water lawyers, because there's going to be a whole lot of litigation in the years ahead between people downstream, cities, industries, who have been told for many, many years that the water in the stream is theirs, and people upstream who have now been told by the courts that the same water, though in the ground, belongs to them. The second great issue facing us in the coming generation, Texas is 95% privately owned. And the biggest single terrestrial environmental problem that we face is the continued fragmentation of family land. We lose ancestral lands in Texas faster than any other state. We probably lost 2 million acres of family lands between 1997 and 2007. No state is fragmenting as rapidly as we are, and that means all of our watersheds, all of our wildlife habitat, all of our open space is at risk, and we must find a way in the years ahead to keep private landowners on their lands and doing the right thing. You heard me say that I spend a whole lot of time and money buying public land for wildlife refuges, parks, all kinds of uses, and hopefully when they shove me in the crematorium, I'm still going to be holding a deed to a public park. But if the legislature gave a guy like me the entire state budget for a year to buy land with, it would only change the amount of land in public ownership by maybe 1%. We cannot buy enough land to solve this problem. We have to find ways to keep private landowners on the land and doing the right thing. So while Bob Armstrong was still alive, we held a celebration out at Big Bend Ranch to celebrate the 20th anniversary of its acquisition. At the time, my grandson was in kindergarten. He lived in New Jersey in the New York suburbs, but he'd never been out there, so I invited my family to come down, and they brought him out, and we kept an eye on him. He seemed to be entertaining himself. He found a horseshoe and some rocks, and he was playing and seemed to be having a good time, but it was hard to know what kind of effect the event had on him. So he goes back to New Jersey at age 5, and the teacher assigns the class to select an animal that migrates, tell where it would migrate to and why. Well, he picks an eagle. And of course, it's 5-year-old handwriting. The E's this big, and the A's this big, and the G's upside down. And the picture, you'd have to be told what it was because it didn't look like an eagle. But he says that he would migrate to Texas so he could go out to Big Bend and see the stars. The most important thing that this organization is doing, that each one of you can do, is to get a kid in the water. Take a child fishing. Take them canoeing. The Galveston Bay Foundation is leading that effort, and we must find ways to teach our kids that being in and around the water is fun, that it has a spiritual dimension, but that it will not be there unless they take responsibility for it. And that is one of the most important things, not only that this wonderful organization is doing, but that each and every one of us can do during the course of the year. Thank you all very much. Go Astros.
Hey, we have a small thank you for Andy. For you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
All right, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Andy. And I've got a couple quick notes before we leave, just to emphasize the importance of land conservation. Galveston Bay Foundation is an accredited land trust. We've conserved over 8,000 acres of land around Galveston Bay. We have a fund in need effort going on outside near the silent auction where we're trying to raise $15,000 to close out a conservation easement we purchased. It's a $900,000 deal. We raised about half of that money through grant funding and half of it privately. We have $15,000 left. So if you'd like to stop by and help cement the need for that conservation easement over in Chambers County, we'd really appreciate it. So you can do that outside. Another plug. This is about the luncheon today, not the capital campaign, but we announced our capital campaign last year. Kickoff for an education center and headquarters on the bay in Kemah. And I just want to let you know it's ongoing. We've reached 27% of our roughly $20 million goal. So we've raised some money, but we've got a lot more to raise. If you're interested in hearing about that, please let me know. And then finally, just to plug another event, Galveston Bay Foundation was started in 1987, and we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And to highlight that 30th anniversary, we're going to do a special event next year on April 7th at the Texas Corinthian Yacht Club. It's going to be an extra event next year. We're going to do our luncheon in the fall, but add this spring event. We've got 3 amazing co-chairs. Lindy and Larry Nyhouse, Mimi and Charlie Prelo, and Emily and Clayton Forswell. We'd love for you to consider joining that event with us next year as well. So before we totally break, I'm going to ask Frank to come up here, and I've got to thank you for Frank as well.
Oh, thanks.
Picture time? Can we get a picture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like that.
All right, here we go. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all.
All right. All right, I know we're anxious to get out of here. Organizations like this one need your help. Thank you for being here. Please consider using the envelopes on your tables to give us a donation. We have staff that's going to be coming around to collect those envelopes. If you need a little more time, they'll also be behind the doors as you exit, so they are easy to spot, and you can hand your donation to them. Please consider donating to the Gordy Marsh Fund, a Fund in Need effort in the back as well. It's a great effort to conserve over 17,000 acres of land on the bay, just north of Smith Point in Chambers County. So, on behalf of the Galveston Bay Foundation, thank you for being here. Auction checkout is in the back lobby. Mark your calendars for GBF's 30th, as we mentioned, on April 7th, and we'll be back here in November of next year. Thank you.